Welcome back to Lecture 2. My name is Melvin Rogers, Associate Professor of Political Science at Brown University. Once again, let me apologize in advance that I'm not there to deliver this to you. So let's jump right into this lecture, and as a matter of course, I will make some references to the first lecture. One startling consequence of racial domination is precisely how deep it runs in our ethical and political life. Precisely for this reason, African Americans, Black Americans often make appeals to the character of the nation, or they often invoke the culture of the polity as a way to indicate to their audiences the depth of the problem. Now, to be sure, questions of who we are as a nation and who we ought to be typically mingle with more narrowly focused questions of what policy we should endorse and what law ought to be on the books. But focus too long on these latter questions, and you are likely to miss the importance of the former. Political societies are, after all, ethical ventures. Contained within them are traditions and ways of being, sometimes at odds, which not only reflect the standing of persons, but also provide guidance on how to treat others with whom we share society. This way of seeing the matter is not new. We can trace it back to the ethical and political philosophies of Aristotle, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Hegel, and the Scottish moral sense tradition of David Hume and Adam Smith. In the American context, we see it at work in Thomas Jefferson in the 18th century and the pragmatists, such as William James, John Dewey, George Herbert Mead, Jane Addams, and Alain Locke in the 19th and 20th century. For all of these thinkers, the meaning of society is developed and expressed through the cultural systems that shape from above and from below the social practices in which members of the polity move, the social psychological horizon of human life, we might say. The most visible versions of this is when classes of persons in a political society are not, for example, permitted to vote or hold office. But subtler and more insidious versions of this are at play when one refuses, as an affirmation of role expectation, to have intimate, mundane interactions with those classes of persons on the streets and classrooms and stores and in churches. We also see this when one's aspirations are circumscribed at the moment of inception, reflecting one's subordinate standing in society. This reminds us of David Walker's worry about the enslaved freeman as discussed in the last lecture. Walker's reflections on domination, his discussion of Republican liberty, his affirmation of racial solidarity, and invocation of an appeal to character were all part of his attempt to get his fellows to address the social psychological norms of Black civility and white supremacy. But Walker was not alone. He belongs to a tradition of thinking, arguments extended in time, to use Alasdair MacIntyre's language, that draws on and reconfigures democratic republicanism. In the hands of Black folks, this tradition plays on similar themes and tropes, seeking to force America, as W.B. Du Bois once said, to look into the depths of its soul. Whereas my previous lecture has taken democratic Republican thinking for granted, this lecture brings it under critical scrutiny to tease out precisely why character and the cognitive affective dimension of those who inhabit the American polity figure so prominently. In this regard, I do not merely claim that Walker and others use republicanism on par with their white revolutionary counterparts. I insist that they reconfigured its meaning in the service of political transformation. This recasting by African Americans, as we will see, is not without its internal disagreements over how deep the problem runs. Indeed, while some envision white Americans as susceptible to transformation, others are doubtful about the likelihood of a racially inclusive society. But what is important is that each holds in view the ethical life of the polity of American society. Early African American political thought and activism draws on two different strands of republicanism. The first emerges from the emphasis placed on the character of the citizenry, mostly white citizens, and its failure to display the appropriate behavior toward African Americans. Black thinkers in the early 19th century see exclusion as rooted in the motivations and attitudes of the citizens that in turn shape the laws of the polity. the questions of who are we and who ought we to be, imagines the political community as an ethical enterprise of invention rather than the expression of pre-political shared values that we come to somehow discover in nature. African Americans direct their intellectual energies to the ethos of the American polity, treating laws and institutions as important, but nonetheless derivations from the characterological propensities of the nation. And when I use the word ethos, I mean the manners and way of life of the citizenry that is continuous with and underwrite the rules of the political state. Republicanism in this guise is has its roots in what J.G.A. Pocock classically identified as ideas of civic virtue, political participation, and character as central to a self-determining polity. Now, the second strand is expressed through African Americans' desire to escape the internal tyranny of the United States. Republicanism in this guise, as Quentin Skinner and Philip Pettit argue, treats arbitrary power exercised over another as the hallmark of slavery. This iteration of republicanism has its roots in classical Rome, is rearticulated by Machiavelli during the Renaissance, and is defended by thinkers in the modern period, such as James Harrington, Montesquieu, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. For this strand, the security of freedom depends on A, a republic imposing constitutional constraints that guards against arbitrary power, and B, providing institutional spaces that allow citizens contestatory power to ensure the proper functioning of a constitutional order. Now, the two different strands of republicanism are connected in the following way. The characterological orientation of the first helps to realize and stabilize the institutional meaning of freedom found in the second. For each of the two strands, Black intellectuals and activists add to the meaning of republicanism. Sometimes the addition comes in the form of using republicanism's concepts, let's say civic virtue, for example, in a situation not otherwise addressed. In other instances, it involves complicating the central concepts, let's say freedom and non-domination, by situating them within a different experiential context. This second approach does not merely involve redeploying republicanism, but supplementing its theoretical toolbox so that it can work within the specific context in which it is located. African Americans were, after all, not deploying a tradition that was conceptually ready for their situation. Rather, their very use of the tradition involved conceptual reconfiguration. Attending to the various figures in African American political thought allows us to avoid, I think, the troublesome interpretive claim by contemporary thinkers that by the 19th century republicanism was in retreat or already eclipsed. As Quentin Skinner, an intellectual historian, puts it, quote, with the rise of classical utilitarianism in the 18th century, the idea of republicanism eventually slipped almost wholly out of sight, end quote. The point is more forcefully stated by political philosopher Philip Pettit when he tells us that, quote, the Republican idea was displaced without anyone ever noticing. But surely when we attend to the ongoing problem of slavery in the 19th century and the ascendancy of Jim Crow in the wake of the Civil War, we shall find the language of republicanism very much alive. This suggests that we need only expand our narratives of the past to avoid the blind spot at work in the present neo-republican revival. But this matters not merely because we should try to be historically accurate, we should, but because this 19th century contribution by African Americans helps us to understand something about the nature of racialized domination that continues to dog ethical and political life into our present moment. And I'll come back to this at the end. How then do African American intellectuals touch, add to, and redeploy the two strands of republicanism I mentioned above? From the 1830s to the 1850s, thinkers such as David Walker, Hosea Easton, Martin Delany, and Frederick Douglass, all Black, all abolitionists, reconfigured civic virtue under conditions of racial domination as the justification for solidarity among Blacks. As these thinkers use it, Republican liberty involves an important insight. Whereas variants of republicanism typically argue for the necessity of civic virtue to the republic, these thinkers direct their Black audience to the necessity of solidarity with the race given the racialized nature of domination they confront. For them, racial domination absorbs the identity of individuals into a larger racial classification that is itself associated with certain negative attributes. This becomes the basis for treating blacks unequally. Approached from this angle, the following question emerges: what entailments follow from civic virtue under conditions of racial domination? The answer turns out to be, as I argue, an endorsement of racial solidarity. Yet even among them, they disagree about the political implications of their positions, offering weak and strong versions of racial solidarity. Whereas some see racial solidarity as a temporary position on the road to reimagining an inclusive society and in turn transforming the polity, the weak version of racial solidarity, it is Martin Delany who understands racial solidarity as a permanent state, leading to an endorsement of immigration in the 1850s. This is the strong version. As I maintain toward the end of the lecture, they also complicate Republicanism's commitment to freedom against domination by confronting it with race. All of these thinkers are worried about slavery, but the meaning of slavery, a master who exercises power at his or her whim, extends beyond the formal practices of enslavement. Here, slavery's reach is dispersed throughout the cultural sphere of American life, circumscribing black Americans even in instances where there is no obvious master. You will recall from the previous lecture, this was the problem facing the bootblack. Frederick Douglass succinctly but powerfully, I think, captures the point in his 1848 speech to the National Negro Convention in Cleveland, to which he was appointed as president. Quote, "In northern states, we are not slaves to individuals, not personal slaves, yet in many respects we are the slaves of the community." End quote. To enjoy liberty does not involve being free from the arbitrary mercy of any particular agent or having laws that would limit forms of arbitrary power. Rather, to enjoy liberty involves transforming the cultural system of valuation on which blacks occupy a lower position of worth. This could not be achieved by merely tracking institutional domination, but by also attending to its racialized form that generated bad ethical and political habits. When Republicanism encounters racial domination, the question turns out to be the following: how might we add to the conceptual toolbox such that freedom as non-domination can do its distinctive work for African Americans? Against the backdrop of race, freedom as non-domination requires that black Americans be seen or taken in a certain way by their fellows that is not exclusively about formal positive laws. On this view, Philip Pettit's identification of republicanism with satisfying, quote, the range of constitutional constraints associated broadly with the mixed constitution, and his linking of domination to the presence of a dominus or master obscures the levels of concern that we find in African American political thought and practice. By focusing on constitutionalism and positive law, Pettit specifically, but the tradition of republicanism more generally, fails to understand the nature of racialized domination where African Americans are concerned. In other words, racialized domination is not about a political standing now in doubt or denied as traditionally understood that can be rectified by institutional reconfiguration, but it is tied to a belief that one was never fit for freedom in the first place. Focusing on this issue explains the concern by black Americans to transform the cultural logic of American life, that is, to avoid being the slave of the community, as Douglass says. So let us first deal with the issue of civic virtue as racial solidarity and the differences that divide some of the thinkers during this period. We begin once more with David Walker's incendiary 1829 appeal to the colored citizens of the world. Published in Boston, the pamphlet traveled along the eastern seaboard through a loose interracial network, emboldening some and sparking the indignation of others. It traveled well into Georgia and as far west as Louisiana. On the one hand, the pamphlet marks the end of earlier deferential appeals by African Americans, and on the other, it set in motion forceful criticisms by African Americans of slavery and domination that became the hallmark of the struggle for freedom. Walker's appeal confronts the reader with the tragic details of being black in the United States, and in doing so, calls into question the very humanity of white Americans. Any man, writes Walker in Article 2 of this 4-article appeal, who is curious to see the full force of ignorance developed among the colored people of the United States of America, has only to go into the southern and western states of this confederacy, where, if he is not a tyrant but has the feelings of a human being who can feel for a fellow creature, he may see enough to make his very heart bleed, end quote. You will remember this from the last lecture. The invocation of sentiment captured metaphorically in the bleeding heart should not be separated from the theme of character. Walker participates in the wider intellectual culture of sentimental appeals central to early African American and American moral and political thought. He thus aligns the capacity for fellow feeling with the image of being a human, and then uses this as the moral compass to orient readers to the daily treatment of black people. Walker's pamphlet agrees with Hosea Easton's remark in his 1837 A Treatise on the Intellectual Character and Civic and Political Condition of the colored people of the United States that, quote, a government like this is at any time liable to be revolutionized by the people at any and every time there is a change of public sentiment. This, perhaps, is as it should be, end quote. Easton was a Methodist minister and was politicized during the 1820s as his family experienced the horror of racism in the North. For both he and Walker, the goal of their reflections is to cultivate the proper response toward the harm of black people that in turn can produce a just society in which all can share. The emphasis on character and public sentiment is not new, even if it takes on a different articulation in Walker and Easton. It finds some of its most important expressions among classical Republican thinkers, such as Aristotle, Cicero, and is reaffirmed in the American thinkers such as Jefferson and Adams. But we are likely to miss the difference between African Americans and these more traditionally recognized thinkers and political actors if we conclude here. Whereas black intellectuals deploy character talk to highlight the fracture at the core of the American polity, others appeal to character and public sentiment to affirm and stabilize the white male portion of the polity that they nonetheless imagine as constituting the whole of society. The themes of character and public sentiment also combine with Republicanism's emphasis on the common good. For Aristotle, Cicero, and many of the American founders, the stability of the polity depends on proper attentiveness. They all interpret civic virtue as a form of attentiveness that helps to integrate the community. Citizens must, as Cicero writes in On Duties, quote, fix their gaze so firmly on what is beneficial to citizens and care for the whole body of the republic, rather than protect one part and neglect the rest, end quote. Civic virtue infuses and underwrites political participation and thus grounds solidarity among the citizenry. What then is one to do in the face of the differential application of care and concern? After all, the idea of common in the term common good is at once circumscribed by both racism and patriarchy, and thus tethered to only a portion of the recognizable population of the United States. How does one act when one part of the polity is protected, as Cicero worried, and the other neglected? These questions animate thinkers like Walker and Easton, allowing them to redirect the gaze of republicanism to the condition of internal slavery in the absence of mutual recognition. When republicanism is directed to the condition of black subordination and slavery, civic virtue does not produce attentiveness to a whole from which one is excluded. Rather, solidarity among the excluded becomes the foundation for responding to the polity as a whole. Civic virtue, now directed to the condition of African Americans, generates a form of solidarity grounded in one's racial identity. In the last lecture, I argued that Walker supported the necessity of racial solidarity, but I merely asserted the claim and did not fully provide his defense of it. I now offer that defense, and with reference to a broader constellation of thinkers. How precisely did Walker and Easton, and now we can add Delaney and Frederick Douglass, understand racial solidarity? To answer this question, we need to first get clear about the functioning of racial classification. Briefly, racial classification takes the form of assigning meaning to what Paul Taylor refers to as, quote, human bodies and bloodlines, end quote, that permits one to, quote, draw inferences about more distant, often non-physical matters such as intelligence, imagination, moral agency, etc. The meaning of one's racial classification in the 18th and 19th century functions as a global category. It allows one to make judgments about particular individuals that fall under specific racial categories. As Thomas Jefferson, for example, argues in the Notes on the State of Virginia of 1787, especially Query 14, regardless of the biological source of one's blackness, its meaning is of importance for understanding the capacities of Black Americans. Although Jefferson advances it as a suspicion, no one doubted the force of his claim that, quote, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, the blacks are inferior to the whites in the endowments of body and mind, end quote. On this view, blacks literally become interchangeable no matter where they live in the country. Hence, Walker says to his northern readers, quote, if any of you wish to know how free you are, let one of you start and go through the southern and western states of this country, and unless you have your free papers, which, if you are not careful, they will get from you, they will sell you into eternal slavery, end quote. This is because it is a presumed universalism of the category of race that defines the proper status of African Americans as unfree. And it is the presumed interchangeability of black people in the eyes of white Americans that fuels the defense of solidarity. As Walker says, quote, I advanced it therefore to you not as a problematical but as an unshaken and forever immovable fact, that your full glory and happiness as well as all other colored people under heaven shall never be fully consummated, but with the entire emancipation of your enslaved brethren, end quote. This point is echoed throughout Easton's pamphlet as well. For both of them, coordinated effort with other blacks to resist racial domination and transform the system responsible for it is necessary to generate and sustain a successful black community. Solidarity is thus a functional outgrowth or response to racial categorization. In the idiom of pragmatism, racial solidarity is a response to the objective conditions that one experiences. But this, once again, is only a weak form of racial solidarity. And why is that the case? Walker and Easton's argument endorse racial solidarity as the initial move toward a more racially inclusive society. They hold out the possibility of ethical and political transformation and seek to awaken their white counterparts to get them to see that in dominating black folks they betray the meaning of their republicanism. In this, they are not yet committed, that is to say, Walker and Easton, to the proposition that white Americans are beyond transformation or that the habit of civility by blacks and the practice of domination by whites fully exhaust the ethos of the nation. Precisely because they do not subscribe to the idea that white supremacy has fully captured the character of the nation, a position from which Martin Delany will depart shortly, racial solidarity only expresses itself as a nascent form of group unity that envisions a society in which all may, at some future time, enjoy freedom and equality. On the evening of December 13th, 1850, the faculty of Harvard's medical school met at the house of then Dean Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. to discuss various petitions regarding the admission of 3 African Americans and 1 woman to school. Although Holmes had already granted admission to the students and the men would be allowed to attend for a semester, the woman had already withdrawn. It was ultimately deemed, quote, inexpedient after the present course to admit colored students to attendance or medical lectures, end quote. Explaining his position, Holmes said in a letter of 1850, the faculty is now convinced, quote, that the intermixing of the white and black races in their lecture rooms is distasteful to a large portion of the class and injurious to the interests of the school, end quote. Holmes was expressing and affirming views articulated in an earlier resolution passed by a majority of the students. Quote, this is the resolution, quote, whereas blacks have been admitted to the lectures of the medical department of Harvard University, therefore resolved that we deem the admission of blacks to the medical lectures highly detrimental to the interests and welfare of the institution of which we are members, calculated alike to lower its reputation in this and other parts of the country, to lessen the value of a diploma from it, and to diminish the number of its students. Resolved, that we cannot consent to be identified as fellow students with blacks whose company we would not keep in the streets and whose society as associates we would not tolerate in our houses." End quote. Martin Delany, one of the 4 admitted students, left Harvard Medical School in March of 1851. He was not permitted to return. It is not unsurprising to find Delany defender of black nationalism and subsequent certified physician. It is not difficult and unsurprising to note that he follows the logic of solidarity to his natural conclusion, given the seemingly fixed quality of racial domination. But I'm less interested in the logic of black nationalism, a theme that has been well trodden, and more concerned to discuss the ethical presuppositions regarding white Americans specifically and the American polity more generally that pushed Delany to embrace this political ideology. His signature political philosophical text, The Condition, Elevation, Immigration, and Destiny of the Colored People of the United States, published in April 1852, represents a powerful indictment of American life. Delany was born in 1816 in Virginia, the youngest of 5 children. Although his father was a slave, the legal norms of the state meant that Delany's status followed that of his mother, who was free. After being threatened for teaching her children how to read, Patty Delany moved her children to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania in 1822 and was subsequently joined in 1823 by her husband, who purchased his freedom. Unlike in Virginia, Delany could now attend school, and according to one biographer, his mind was deepened by the great literary and philosophical texts of the West. In 1831, Delany headed west to Pittsburgh, where he became an active member in anti-slavery circles, joining the African Education Society, the Moral Reform Society, and the Pittsburgh Anti-Slavery Society. His 1852 text, however, represents an important shift in Delany's thinking, away from his early attempts to transform the polity from within to locating salvation for African Americans beyond American shores. Delany's book is separated by Walker's appeal by more than 2 decades and Easton's treatise by little less. The transformation of the racial context by the 1850s was far darker than it appeared in 1829, if you can believe it. It directly affected his fellow African Americans in the form of the draconian Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, an act that strengthened the previous Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. Emerging out of the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act required that captured slaves who nonetheless found their way to free states were to be returned to their presumptive masters. Delany's text addresses the compromise in the fugitive slave law, prompting him to argue for immigration. Delany's interest in the fugitive slave law brings into sharp focus, I think, his sophisticated understanding of the relationship between law and cultural life that has gone unnoticed. The law does not reveal a society that has betrayed itself as suggested by Walker and Easton, but a social and political community that fundamentally denies the dignity of black folks. This much Delany says, marking a difference between himself and the earlier thinkers. Quote, "We are politically not of them, but aliens to the laws and political privileges of this country. These are truths, fixed facts, that quaint theory and exhausted moralizing fall harmlessly before." End quote. The rejection of moral philosophizing and the idea of African American domination as a fixed fact of American life not only targets thinkers such as Walker and Easton, but most immediately and directly, Frederick Douglass. The Frederick Douglass with whom Delany served as a co-editor on Douglass's newspaper, the North Star. As he says in a letter to Douglass expressing his disappointment that Douglass did not take notice of his 1852 book and in his newspaper, now called Frederick Douglass's paper, quote, "I care but little what white men think of what I say, write, or do. My sole desire is to benefit the colored people. This being done, I am satisfied," end quote. The implication, of course, was that in taking notice of the work of white Americans, as Douglass did with Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom Cabin, published in March of 1852, he was committed to the goal of transforming white Americans and thought such a goal possible. Like Walker and Easton, Douglass agrees in 1848 that the main work for Black American improvement was to be, quote, commenced, carried on, and concluded by ourselves, end quote. Several months earlier, Douglass powerfully connects the past, present, and future of Black Northerners to those enslaved. This is what he writes. Remember that we are one, that our cause is one, and that we must help each other if we would succeed. We have drunk to the dregs the bitter cup of slavery. We have worn the heavy yoke. We have sighed beneath our bonds and wreathed beneath the bloody lash. Cruel mementos of our oneness are indelibly marked in our living flesh. We are one with you under the ban of prejudice and proscription, one with you under the slander of inferiority, one with you in social and political disfranchisement. What you suffer, we suffer. What you endure, we endure. We are indissolubly united and must fall or flourish together, end quote. As Douglass indicates, it is the experiential condition of being Black in the United States, i.e. the cruel mementos of our oneness, and a evaluative structure for one's domination, i.e. the band of prejudice and proscription that necessitates racial solidarity. This, however, does not require, or at least Douglass thought, one to reject the possibility of transforming white Americans and forming a good in which both they and Black Americans can share. And it most certainly, he argued, it most certainly does not require immigration. Douglass thus rejects immigration plans because he A, believes Black Americans have a rightful claim on the polity, and because he B, believes the beliefs and habits of white Americans susceptible to transformation. As he explains in his 1851 essay, Is Civil Government Right? Quote, while man is constantly liable to do evil, he is still capable of apprehending and pursuing that which is good, end quote. Douglass, like Easton and Walker before him, also relies on a perfectionist account of human nature as a condition for his engagement on matters of racial discrimination and domination. And his perfectionism is clearly on display in his 1853 address as an article of faith, albeit now framed as an indictment, when he engages Delaney's book and proposal for immigration. This is what Douglass writes. Quote, we do not object to colonizationists because they express a lively interest in the civilization of Africa, nor because they desire the prosperity of Liberia, but it is because, like Brother Delaney, they have not sufficient faith in the people of the United States to believe that the Black man can ever get justice at their hands on American soil, end quote. Obviously, the endorsement of civilizing Africa is deeply troubling, to say the least. Notwithstanding, this language of faith in the people is an important normative site for sustaining Douglass's utterances and his commitment. But for Delaney, in contrast, Douglass's position denies the facts that reveal the alien status of Black people in the American context. This desire to closely follow the facts to address what fundamentally organizes the United States informs Delaney's analysis of the fugitive slave law and fuels his argument for immigration. Although this point finds support in other writers during the time, such as Mary Ann Shack Carey and James Theodore Holly, it is in Delaney that we find his most sophisticated articulation. We might think of his engagement with the fugitive slave law as his attempt to distill, per his title, the condition of African Americans. What, in other words, is the state or condition in which they find themselves. He focuses on the fugitive slave law because he takes the idea of positive law to express the underlying ethos of the people. His analysis turns on a distinction he makes in the early part of his book. There he says that the moral law, the place where one's, quote, sense and feeling of right and justice lies, is to be distinguished from positive law, or the law of the political state. In the case of the United States, positive law is the result of a cooperative enterprise, and the moral law need not necessarily determine and guide positive law. It is very possible for the polity to voluntarily construct laws that express their underlying commitments and be legitimate to that extent, even as they swing free of right and justice. This is how Delaney puts it. Quote, this is the law of the land, referring to the Fugitive Slave Act, and to suppose its repeal is to anticipate an overthrow of the Confederative Union. And candidly, we believe the existence of the fugitive slave law necessary to the continuance of the national compact. Certainly, we will not be understood as meaning that the enactment of such a law was really necessary, or as favoring in the least this political monstrosity. But we speak logically and politically, leaving morality and right out of the question, taking our position on the acknowledged popular basis of American policy, end quote. The law crystallizes the background attitudinal orientation of the citizenry, but one that stands apart from questions such as, is this right or is this just? But notice what Delaney is doing here. For him, there is a difference between the source or origin from which law issues and its content. Procedurally, if a law emerges from the polity's decision procedure, it is legitimate to that extent. Legitimacy, as he sees it, is about the proper relationship between the physical law and those whose belief and those on whose behalf the law is issued and over whom as determined by the Constitution. He thus connects the political foundation of American society to its largely white male voting population, and he then uses the outcome of their decisions as communicating who the citizenry is and in what their commitments consist. In a Republican polity, the only political actors are those described by its constitutional order or positive laws, or so Delaney argues. And since that is the white property portion of the population, he concludes, quote, a people capable of originating and sustaining such a law as this are not the people to whom we are willing to entrust our liberty at discretion. In his keynote address delivered to the National Immigration Convention of Colored Men in Cleveland, Ohio in 1854, Delaney explains the radical transformation required to change the status of black Americans. Quote, listen to what he says here. In the United States, among the whites, their color is made by law and custom the mark of distinction and superiority, while the color of the blacks is a badge of degradation acknowledged by statute, organic law, and the common consent of the people. With this view of the case, which we hold to be correct, to elevate to equality the degraded subject of law and custom, it can only be done by an entire destruction of the identity of the former condition of the applicant. End quote. By identity here, Delaney has in mind the identity that is ascribed to African Americans by virtue of their race, what he calls the badge of degradation that is instantiated in the political, legal, and cultural life of American society. The identity of white Americans partly comes about, or so Delaney suggests, by virtue of this contrast with their darker counterparts. To overcome this condition requires that one destroy the badge of degradation. But this also involves significantly a willingness by white Americans to destroy the legal and customary badge of superiority they now flaunt. Delaney doubts this possibility not because he thinks it unimaginable, but because he believes, his words not mine, ages incalculable would need to pass in order to claim victory. What untold sacrifices, Delaney can be read as asking, would need to be made by blacks as they wait for whites to become something other than what their conduct suggests and institutions embody. This background understanding frames his account of solidarity. The problem requires not only cooperation among blacks to resist domination, a la Walker and Easton and Douglas, but a more significant form of racial unity that eventuates in the founding of an independent state. Quote, to advocate the immigration of the colored people of the United States from their native homes is a new feature in our history and at first view may be considered objectionable as pernicious to our interests. This objection is at once removed when reflecting on our condition. End quote. As with Walker and Easton, civic virtue is racialized, but against the backdrop of Delaney's analysis, it points beyond the shores of the United States. Immigration turns out not to be an affront to republicanism, but an outgrowth of its logic. If the last set of remarks allowed us to resituate republicanism within the experiential horizon of black life in 19th century America, my concluding reflections now seek to supplement contemporary readings of republicanism's notion of freedom as non-domination so that it can bring into view the specific implications of chattel slavery. The political philosopher Philip Pettit has provided a masterful interpretation of this tradition. But when placed against the backdrop of the condition of early black life, it proves, I think, inadequate owing to the emphasis he places on political institutions and his failure to address the cultural background of white supremacy to which the thinkers above sought to alert us. Now, republicanism need not be displaced, but it is in need of theoretical supplementation to properly align freedom as non-domination with the specificity of the conditions confronted by black Americans. This will also involve disconnecting domination from its primary indicator, namely that of a dominus or master, and connecting it more broadly to culture as such than we see in someone like Philip Pettit. But let us get a handle on Pettit before turning to my worry. In his writings, Republicanism, a theory of freedom and government, and on the people's terms, a Republican theory, a model of democracy, Pettit defends a variant of republicanism that draws from Greek and Roman sources. This version, defined largely by its concern with freedom rather than civic virtue, argues that, quote, people could enjoy liberty both in relation to one another and to the collectivity only by being invested with the power and status of a citizen, end quote. To be a citizen comes with a distinct kind of power, a power to hold at bay those who would privately or publicly have you at their arbitrary mercy. In the absence of said power, one is under a condition of domination. To be dominated, Pettit tells us, involves a relationship in which one has, quote, one, the capacity to interfere, two, on an arbitrary basis, and three, in certain choices that the other is in a position to make, end quote. What is significant here is that the dominating party need not use their power. They need only have the capacity to deploy their power over you if they so choose. This is really what it means to be at the arbitrary mercy of another. You never know when the dominating party will act. As Cicero puts it, a figure from whom Pettit draws intellectual energy, quote, freedom, which is not a matter of having a just master, but of having none at all, end quote. The primary example to which Republicans and the tradition of republicanism are drawn, as implied by Cicero, is the master-slave relationship. To be a slave is to be at the arbitrary mercy of a master, even if the master is of the benevolent kind. Republicanism counters the danger of domination by specifying three of its defining elements. The first is the vision of freedom as non-domination. But how is this realized? It is realized through the second feature, a body of laws that A, track the interests and concerns of the citizenry, and that B, satisfy a range of constitutional constraints associated broadly with the mixed constitution. In the event there is a need to realign state and society with the first 2 points above, point 3 argues that space must be open for citizens to, quote, contest public policies and initiatives, end quote. Now, this is a very brief sketch of Pettit's argument, and who would deny that domination so understood threatens freedom. But it is not clear that this rendering of domination or the response to it effectively addresses the concerns of African Americans. Nor do I think this is peculiar to Pettit's interpretation of the tradition. The reason has to do with the different accounts of slavery to which republicanism is a response, namely political slavery and chattel slavery. Now, walk with me a little longer as we bring this home. Recall that on Pettit's account, freedom is always explained as an opposition between citizenship and slavery. The historical presumption, and this was at work in Aristotle and Harrington as well as the American framers, was that a status that one enjoyed was now denied. And Aristotle, for example, explains Mary Nyquist, political slavery derived its meaning, quote, from an opposition between those for whom it would represent a demeaning traumatic loss and those for whom it was supposed to be natural, end quote. This idea continued well into 17th century England under monarchical rule. While it was true that the English monarch was supreme over his subjects, it did not follow that he could do with them as he pleased. By the time of the American Revolution, the idea was not that the colonists were seeking rights they did not have, but that they were seeking to reclaim their rightful status as British subjects. For example, In 1774, Jefferson criticizes, quote, the wanton exercise of the king's power, end quote, against the rights of British America. The refusal by the king to respond appropriately led the colonists to address him accordingly in the Declaration of Independence, quote, a prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. But let us not lose the true meaning of the point here. The idea was that A, monarchy and the idea of a free people could fit seamlessly together, and B, the king had now acted illegitimately, thus making him a tyrant or master. From Aristotle to the British monarchy to the American founders, political slavery involved the denial to those of their rightful standing. A dominating figure was one that acted against standing laws and customs or outside the boundaries of constitutional norms. Addressing this situation merely involved a proper alignment with standing laws and customs or ensuring the proper functioning of constitutional norms. Hence Jefferson in 1775 longed for, quote, a restoration of our just rights, end quote. And John Dickinson also in 1775 found it unimaginable that, quote, any idea of freedom and happiness for these colonies for several ages to come could be had, but in a state of legitimate dependence upon and subordination to the British Crown, end quote. The colonists did not create a polity de novo, rather they established a polity that better aligned with norms with which they were familiar. Pettit's Republicanism develops out of this thread of thinking. This explains why freedom as non-domination is realized through the proper establishment of positive laws and constitutional order that removes the threat of tyranny. But here's the issue. What if the problem is not the denial of a status one already enjoyed in a political community, but is about the belief that one's standing as a slave is natural, as was the case for African Americans? If the latter is the case, as it was, then Pettit's configuration of republicanism will prove inadequate. Indeed, the entirety of the tradition that focuses on political slavery will miss the depth of the problem. Chattel slavery is of a different kind because it is tied to normative claims about white superiority and the natural subordination of black people. It cannot, therefore, be effectively addressed by the response one would provide to the problem of political slavery. In understanding this distinction between political versus chattel slavery, we should therefore focus less on the figure of the master or dominus that political and chattel slavery share, and more on the idea that in the first case, political slavery, one's status as a slave is a violation of recognized standing, and in the second case, chattel slavery, one's status as a slave is perceived to be natural. One cannot reclaim a status in a community that one never had, prompting Delaney to describe the American polity as alien to blacks as they are alien to it. It is this second configuration that extends well beyond the figure of the master into the domain of culture itself. This is what Douglass has in mind in his 1848 address when he says of nominally free blacks, quote, in northern states, we are not slaves to individuals, not personal slaves, yet in many respects we are the slaves of the community, end quote. So how are we to understand this idea of being a slave of the community? For it is this that unites the nominally free blacks in northern states with their physically enslaved fellows in the South. Consider once more a passage I quoted from Walker, quote, if any of you wish to know how free you are, let one of you start and go through the southern and western states of this country. And unless you have your free papers, which if you are not careful, they will get from you, they will sell you into eternal slavery. Part of what Walker is doing is trying to capture the way race functions. It has internal content that functions as a universal category to eclipse the subjectivity or contextual specificity of the lives of individual blacks. But something more is at work here, the elements of which tragically reverberate across time, making the imprecision of contemporary republicanism all the more troubling. As Easton explains, the meaning of one's racial designation is an auxiliary to slavery and legal codes of exclusion following, quote, its victims into every avenue of life. Today, we refer to this as racial stigma because it shapes the social epistemic context in which we stand and from which we draw to make judgments about our fellows. The negative connotations associated with African Americans, Easton argues, are located in, quote, public sentiment and biases the observing agent. The auxiliary to slavery, these negative connotations, he explains, quote, is capable of accommodating itself to local circumstances and conditions and appearing with all the nature of the old beast slavery, end quote. The point is that the demeaning qualities attached to blacks persist through institutional transformation and as such retain residual ideas of the presumed superiority of whites and presumed subordination of blacks, the old beast slavery. Hence, chattel slavery can disappear, he reasons, and yet continues to cast a long shadow that leaves the civic and ethical existence of black Americans precarious. This is what scholars call the afterlife of slavery. Easton is describing the logic of white supremacy that lives beyond any specific institutional instantiation. This explains why in the 19th century blacks traveling in specific states had to carry free papers. Traveling with free papers was meant to render one exempt from the natural or normal status of blacks as inferior per the classification, and therefore to the stigma of race, i.e. what follows them into every avenue of life. It is difficult to deny that in our own time a similar logic creates a condition wherein the natural or normal status of blacks easily mingled with presumed traits of criminality and immorality in the minds of observing citizens and conditions their behavior toward black folks, regardless of any observable conduct on display. As Easton arguments imply, this social epistemic context renders the status of blacks, the lives they lead, and the activity they undertake uncertain, subject to domination at best and at worst, death. The enormity of this insidious framework is what caused the Lenin to abandon faith in transformation. And in our contemporary moment, this logic unites the new Jim Crow analysis of legal scholar Michelle Alexander with political scientists such as Veshla Weaver and Amy Lerman and Lisa Miller. But it also underwrites references to the afterlife of slavery that you see in contemporary scholars of African American studies such as Jerry Sexton, Saida Hartman, and Eddie Glaude. And it haunts the writing of social and political philosophers such as Tommy Shelby, Robert Goodell Williams, and Laurie Balfour. Each of these scholars will offer specific historical explanations related to the economic, personal, legal insecurity of black Americans and the persistence of white supremacy. But what ties these and other narratives together, however, is the norm of black devaluation that defines the cultural life of the polity and infuses the distinct areas of social life through which black folks move that Easton explored so carefully in the 1830s. Given the logic of white supremacy, Easton places less weight, and we should too, on the legal response to slavery and more on its cultural workings. Why? Because he is trying to bring into view the all-important register on which it works. Quote, the system of slavery and its effects is imposed on the injured party in two forms or by two methods. The first method is by a code of law originating in public sentiment as in slave states, The other is prejudice originating in the same public sentiment as it exists in free states. The first method assumes the form of law and therefore is not capable of inflicting such deep injuries as when it exists without the law. We need to be very careful here. Easton is not claiming that chattel slavery does not cause deep harms on those against which it is inflicted. For him, in the context of chattel slavery, prejudice is displaced from public sentiment to codes of law. The law bears the weight of prejudice. And so in the absence of codes of law, the distinction between blacks and whites, between the civility of the one and supposed superiority of the other, must be sustained by something, and that something becomes public sentiment. It must, in other words, find its daily support through the conduct and practices of white Americans in order to police the boundaries between themselves and blacks, lest they be confounded. Easton directs his reader to the cultural status of blacks as subordinates that is the foundation upon which codified laws and institutions rest. But it also forms the social psychological backdrop from which individuals derive norms of regard and disregard, that is, the habits of white supremacy. Addressing the problem, then, is not merely about attending to the existing political juridical framework Rather, one must seek to disrupt the cultural force of prejudice that disciplines both blacks and whites. Quote, merely to cease beating the colored people, says Easton, and leave them in their gore and call it emancipation is nonsense. Nothing short of an entire reversal of the slave system in theory and practice will redeem whites and blacks, end quote. And what Easton says in the 1830s finds re-articulation in Kimberly Crenshaw's insistence that, quote, a society once expressly organized around white supremacist principles does not cease to be a white supremacist society simply by formally rejecting those principles, end quote. From the perspective of the 19th century, these thinkers advanced their argument about the logic of white supremacy to make a more pointed claim to their black counterparts. Those that take themselves to be free, let's say, in northern states, in contrast to the southern states, are deeply and profoundly confused. The reason is simple. To the extent that one cannot travel freely across all states, freedom experienced in any one of the states is an illusion. But notice what is going on here. This is not merely a claim about the laws on the books. Walker, Easton, and even Delaney take seriously not merely the practice of slavery in which one has a master, but the memory of servitude and dominance and the ongoing life of stigma. It emerges from and simultaneously conditions the cultural sphere of American life that reaches beyond physical change. This is why blacks in northern states can also be slaves, albeit of the community. More significantly, freedom turns out to be ephemeral, a temporary break from reality that leaves African American liberty without cultural support. In lacking such support, freedom cannot remain resilient, and for that reason it can hardly be called freedom at all. But the response to this, if confined to the domain of legality, will obscure the deeper sense of standing. And from the dark past of the 19th century, we can finally hear a more compelling argument that speaks to us today. To extend political rights to African Americans, as was the case in the 1860s and 1960s, although important, will do little more than conceal the problem. For the issue is not that they are denied standing they otherwise had in the political community, but that they were never thought fit to have standing at all. To address this requires one to hold in view the lower position of worth black folks occupy on the scale of value that animates American life and continues to haunt our present moment. By attending to the cultural logic of domination, it is precisely this issue that African American thinkers sought to bring into view. Theirs was a reminder that Republicanism's commitment to non-domination, both then and now, demands more than what reliance on the law and constitutionalism can provide. And our continued broad-based denial of this, a refusal to address the characterological and habitual foundation of society out of some presumed aversion to conservatism, as if conservatism must have some lock on character and habitat, will only serve to replicate the problem. Thank you. This concludes the second lecture. Again, my apologies that I'm not there in person to deliver.